Welcome, everyone, to this webinar hosted by the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, on which we will be talking about some of the ways in which digital regulation across national borders has a profound effect for the future of innovation and for the future of freedom. Um, I'm David McGarry. I'm the research director at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. And by way of level setting before we get into some of the substance of the panel, I think it's necessary to note that as technology transcends borders, the regulation of technology also transcends borders. There's a reason why the Digital Markets Act, various digital services taxes passed in several jurisdictions, speech regulations like the UK's Online Safety Act have become a topic of concern, both for the Trump administration here in the United States, but also for policymakers in many other countries. There's two aspects, I think, to this effect, and the first is what we call the Brussels effect, with in with a inherently globalized technology like the internet. Regulatory regimes in one jurisdiction affects the way that companies behave elsewhere. But also, there is a certain, shall we say, philosophy about innovation, about economics, and about speech, and really truly about human action that is swirling in the air on both sides of the Atlantic. We have seen policymakers adopt a far more technocratic and micromanagerial approach. And we have already begun to see that businesses and consumers have been negatively affected. The fact is, for example, in Europe, that consumers have only delayed access to innovative, cutting edge new features. Now, we will get into many more of the specifics, but the tension I think that we are facing with a technology such as the internet is one between local sovereignty and inherently globalized networks. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we resolve the tension in this fact? And perhaps as importantly, how do we resolve this tension in a manner that promotes innovation, the interests of consumers, fair competition, and ultimately liberty? So with that, I would like to introduce my panel, my esteemed panel. We have Graham Dufault. He's the general counsel of the App Association. We have Mike Salem. He is the UK country associate for the Consumer Choice Center. At risk of attracting some regulatory scrutiny from antitrust enforcers, we have a certain concentration of Consumer Choice Center representatives. And next, we have James Czerniawski, who's the head of emerging technology at the Consumer Choice Center. Lastly, we have Renaud Brossard, who is the vice president of communications at the Montreal Institute. Now, each one of these panelists has been brought on today to talk about a different jurisdiction that falls within their area of specialization. So I would like to begin with James. The European Union seems to be the maybe not even 800-pound, but the 8,000-pound gorilla in the room of digital technology. And the fact is that the European Union as a jurisdiction has become fallow ground in recent years for innovation and technology. For decades, EU lawmakers and bureaucrats have more or less salted the earth with as many regulations as they can think up. And in light of that fact, it's hardly surprising that Europeans have very little by way of a homegrown tech sector, and they've come to rely on the products that are mostly designed in America. Now, the Digital Markets Act, which we have referenced, is sort of the centerpiece of this regulatory regime at present. And I would say, what is the general approach of laws like the DMA? Or if I could phrase the question slightly differently, what are the steps that Brussels has taken to extend the reach of its regulatory apparatus over companies that don't in fact lie within its jurisdiction?
Yeah, that's a great question, David, and thanks for having me at the risk of having any kind of scrutiny from the CMA or other European authorities. It's good to be here. But when it comes to the DMA and the European Union's approach, I mean, it's really just the latest action by the Commission in a string of different regulatory efforts to go and blatantly target American firms. So notably, within the DMA. They had these gatekeeper designations that they were doing, and when they finally unveiled their list of all the different companies that would go and be subjected to this treatment, 5 out of 7 were American firms, unsurprisingly. Europe, as you kind of indicated, doesn't really have much of a tech sector, so the number of firms that kind of got implicated there were non-existent because they don't really have much of a sector to go along with there, right? I think back to this image of showing firms, even just basic startup firms that end up getting over $100 billion market cap valuation in the United States versus Europe. And it's just like a ton in the United States and very little to go and show for it within the European Union, more broadly speaking, right? So, I think that part of the reason why it is so problematic is that when you're looking at the history of how the European Union has done its regulation, I think that it's really just reinforcing this culture of treating American technology firms like a piggy bank to go and basically fund their broader apparatus here. They've fined American companies to the tunes of billions of dollars. And again, these companies are offering services that Europeans do like. They actually enjoy these things, but because of the strict and onerous regulations underneath things like the General Data Privacy rules or regulations, rather the GDPR and things like the DMA, we are seeing that American companies are increasingly drawing their red line in the sand, right? So you mentioned how certain products and features are not going to get, rolled out in the European Union as fast. Notably, this week you have new AirPods that are coming out from Apple, and one of the coolest features of it is that it's going to have live translation. The European Union is known for having a lot of languages that these people have to speak at the same time. Not necessarily the same issue that we have here in the United States, right? But they're not going to have access to that feature. Why? Because, as Apple explicitly stated, it's in no small part due to the regulatory climate that's in the European Union. And I think that what's also important to highlight here, too, it's not just the GDPR, it's not just the DMA. You have the DSA, the Digital Services Act, which I know we'll also probably cover as well. But you also have the EU Space Act, the EU's AI Act. It's just this culture of pernicious regulation. As the famous saying goes, the United States innovates, China replicates, and the European Union likes to regulate. And that's really the core fundamental issue here.
Well, thank you, James. I think that was very well said and very insightful. So I'm going to board a boat across the English Channel to the United Kingdom and go to Mike. So, Mike, let's begin with the UK's Digital Markets Consumers and Competition Act of 2024. Now, I was reading something you wrote about this, and your analysis of the law raised for me the question of time. Markets are always developing, technologists are always innovating, and this process happens at light speed. If anybody doubts this, they can just look and see that the internet of today is very different from the internet of 2020. I'd like for you to discuss the problems that arise from attempts to apply static ways of thinking or static regulations, which, by the way, are likely out of date by the time that they are even enacted to these sorts of dynamic and changing and fluid markets.
Absolutely. The problem with creating regulation, especially when it comes to innovation and tech, is once you decide to regulate, we've already moved on. So, to our listeners tonight, the Digital Markets Consumer and Competition Bill was first written in 2022, and it wasn't passed till, I believe, 2024. And then what it did, it created a special unit within the Competition and Markets Authority called the Digital Markets Unit, which allows them to designate companies as being of a strategic market status, which means they can impose restrictions and interventions on them to be more competitive. Now, these investigations, I've been engaging with the CMA on Apple and Google investigations, and they have taken 7 months. Now, if it takes you 7 months just to designate, followed by good few months to, actually impose what you want to impose, You're already too late to the game. And we warned them of that very early on when they were consulting. They always consult, and it's always a 100-page document, and they expect the consumer to go back home, or the average citizen to, worked hard, then go back home and read 100 pages on self-preferencing, which is completely outrageous to do. At any rate, so they launched all these consultations, and back then we told them, well, look, even your AI strategies, they are so outdated, and they only had one line, and they're talking about Google search dominance. Well, I'm afraid many of my friends now use ChatGPT. I mean, let's talk real consumer activity here. So by the time they've realized, oh, actually, maybe Google has a monopoly, people have moved on. To give you another concrete example, in Europe and the EU, they decided to stop Google from self-preferencing Google Maps. So the result was actually people looked up Google Maps in Google. So actually, Google Map searches went up by 10%. So it did completely the opposite of what the regulators intended to do. Uh, it is very difficult to legislate statically. Regulators like to do it because you can measure it, you can sort of say we did one, two, and three. But in reality, it really affects the consumer rather negatively. And I'm afraid the solution for that, I'm not saying there's no solution and, we should abolish all governments. I know that's some libertarian dream for some of us. But the real solution here is for us to actually work with the industry, because there's lots of self-regulation that works within the industry and they are successful at it. I mean, we're going to talk about online safety later on, but you've got Meta, you've got Instagram, you've got all these companies that are able to put parenting control, for example. You can do the same thing with competition. You can work between, they can work between themselves, these different companies, to ensure that they don't harm the consumer at the end of the day. And it is quite successful at doing that, especially in the digital sphere. Therefore, there's always an answer, but regulators like to intervene because they've got a big stake in it as well. I mean, the regulation says if companies refuse to comply with the restrictions, then they could be liable up to 10% of their turnover. And that's a very good sum of money for the organization that just had to lay off 10% of its staff due to a budgeting error. So there are lots of different interests here at stake. James mentioned a bit about trying to break down American companies. It might be another way for governments to generate revenue. So you've got to manage all these different interests. I'm afraid that's how politics work, and the UK is no different.
Thanks, Mike. And here in Washington, the Department of Justice found that in the brief year between the liability finding in the Google case and the remedies finding in the Google case, AI took on a far greater significance in the mind, at least, of Judge Amit Mehta, the federal district court judge in the case. AI did not feature prominently in the liability finding, and then to the distress of the DOJ and its boosters, AI was, or I should say, the remedies ruling was shot through with a discussion of how artificial intelligence is beginning to change the online search market. Now, I'm going to continue my journey westward across the Atlantic Ocean, and I will land on the beautiful shores of Canada. So, Renaud, many of the developments in EU tech policy and UK tech policy have been featured prominently on the front pages and the home pages of our publications here in America. But I would say that most Americans don't have much of an idea of necessarily what's going on in Canadian tech policy. So if I could ask you first, what has been what have been some of the most recent developments in Canadian tech policy? And then if I could add a second question of that, from my read of Canadian tech policy, there seem to be two ideas that are held currently that are somewhat at odds and somewhat in tension with one another. First, I detect an anxiety that Canada's tech sector has fallen behind, has fallen behind the rest of the world. And second, there seems to be a good deal of caution with respect to technology's potential to destabilize something about the cultural or economic fabric of the country. So, with maybe a brief description of what's going on, and then what do you think about this tension?
Absolutely. So if I can start first with some of the developments that have happened in Canada, I think in a lot of cases, legislators and regulators like to look elsewhere for inspiration, and unfortunately, in our case, they look to Europe. So some of what we've had, so I think recently some of you in the US might have heard about Canada's digital services tax. This was a tax of 3% on the revenues of uh, large platforms that were active in Canada's markets that had at least 750 million in global revenue and 20 million bucks in Canadian revenues. Now, those numbers were not picked by accident. The stated goal of the government at the time, although it did not write it into law, was to go after Facebook, after Meta, Google, and a lot of the other large streaming platforms. What do you think happens when you have a tax of 3% of revenue? Well, it's very easy for Google to just increase prices by 3% and then pass on the tax to the consumer. I can tell you, it's exactly what happened with us. And I've looked at some of our Google ad bills, some of my personal Netflix bills. The increase has been pretty much all passed on to the consumer, and always in this idea of protecting the Canadian market. It's clear that Canadians enjoyed watching shows on Netflix. We still go on Facebook despite the fact that we can't find the news on there anymore. There's a lot of things that we do, but all of this was thought about was to try and basically get a little bit of money from some American firms to then use it to subsidize some local firms such as newspapers. And now we talk about the Digital Services Act, the Digital Services Tax, sorry, that sort of brings me into the next one, which was the Online News Act, or Bill C-18. I alluded to the fact that Canadians cannot see news on Facebook anymore. It's not because the Canadian government decided to ban news going on Facebook. Rather, it was a business decision from Facebook that makes sense. The federal government decided to put this law into place at a request of the newspaper publishers, who said that simply sharing their link was tantamount to stealing their content. So if I am to put a link to something from the Globe and Mail on Facebook, well, the Canadian government now assumes that this means that Facebook is stealing the Globe and Mail's content unless Facebook pays for it. Understandably, Facebook did not want to have to, or Meta, sorry, did not want to have to pay an amount of money in tax every year that was based on how many people decided to share links from certain news media websites. So it made a decision to shut down news sharing on its website. It has not had the apocalyptic effect that some of the newspapers described that it would have on Facebook. People still go on Facebook. They still post cat pictures as much as they used to. But the effect that it has had, unfortunately, has been to lower traffic on Canadian newspaper websites. And amongst those, especially the smaller, newer media upstarts that were relying on online advertising to be able to get their content to more eyeballs and to sell some advertising. And then the last one, especially when we get to this new media aspect, has been the Online Streaming Act. So that's Bill C-11. If you're interested in that sort of technicality, but essentially, a lot of it has been about trying to not trying to adapt a regulation to current technologies and essentially what consumers now demand. It's been about trying to make the current technologies fit in the boxes that were conceived to fit radio and television back in the 1980s. So the Online Streaming Act is essentially to try and add a discoverability criteria to Canadian content on streaming platforms, whether it is YouTube or Netflix. So this means that based on that act, if I go to Netflix should tweak their algorithm so that the first thing it shows me are pieces of content that the Canadian government approves of because they're Canadian enough. And sort of the same thing with YouTube. It seems dystopian to put it this way, but when you look at it from a perspective of trying to fit everything into the 1980s boxes that were made for radio content and TV content regulation, it sort of makes sense. It's exactly the same thing we have with our Canadian content regulations on radio that meant that I had to listen to way more than my fair share of Nickelback when I was growing up. So a lot of it is still to try and fit everything back into those boxes. In terms of the concerns from the Canadian government and Canadians at large, I think there is a level of anxiety that we are losing ground. I mean, Canada used to be known for selling a lot of cell phones. If people are old enough, they might remember having a BlackBerry that was made in Waterloo. That's where the company was headquartered, and in just a couple of years, that product simply went away. That company did not go bust, but very close to it. And there's a lot of concern about simply the US's ability to innovate at that level. Unfortunately, the regulators have, as much as they've talked about that concern, it hasn't. They haven't made the link that part of it comes with this much more flexible regulation that allows people to try new things, to break things a little bit. And they've been trying to regulate much in the same way that Europe has for the last couple of years.
Thank you, Renaud. I think it's an unfortunate fact that policy debates and our media cycles are filled with a talk and maybe an obsession with the big tech companies, Meta, Google, and the rest. And that leaves the small developers, the startups, the disruptors, the proverbial man in his garage changing the world, completely forgotten. Now, to this point, this webinar has been guilty of the exact same crime. So with that, Graham, I would like to go to you and ask, although the heaviest burdens of many of the regulatory schemes that we've been discussing do in fact land squarely on the biggest platforms, what are the effects of regulation in Canada and the UK, in the EU, on the small developers here in America?
Well, it's a great question. I actually think that the heavier burdens, in many ways, do fall on the smaller companies, even though the direct regulatory focus and the provisions apply specifically to these very specific companies. Because I always start this discussion with taking a look at what my member companies want, and our members, they're just like it sounds. They are app developers. They make connected devices. I call them small tech, and they sort of. You mentioned the garage, like they're from the garage or the WeWork, and they're very nimble. They have sort of a competitive advantage in nimbleness and the ability to sort of quickly innovate and iterate and experiment. So what do they want from online marketplaces, which are kind of the focus of the Digital Markets Act in particular? I'll sort of focus there because that's sort of the epicenter of online marketplace regulations. There's versions of it in the United States that have been proposed, but it's a good place to start. So they want three things, basically, which number one, the ability to offload overhead costs. And those are the really boring costs that just have to do with running a business. They're not the reason somebody gets, usually somebody gets into starting up a company in the first place. They want to solve a problem. They want to create an ed tech tool. They want to create a digital health tool. They're not looking to figure out the tax laws of all the countries in which they're going to distribute or do all the banking stuff. It's not exactly their forte. So the ability to offload the boring stuff, the overhead, and they can do that right now with online marketplaces. Number two, they want to be able to access a global market, and the vast majority of our member companies, whether they're 2 employees or 100 employees, are global. And part of the reason for that is that they can go to the App Store and hit publish, and very quickly they can be on market storefronts all around the world and have access to hundreds of millions of devices that they wouldn't necessarily have access to without these online marketplaces. And then the third thing, and all of it sort of feeds into this, and this is maybe the most important thing, is consumer trust and their ability to lean on the trust that consumers, the end consumers, have in a marketplace in order to sort of fast track. Because otherwise, especially in software, you are sort of trying to build a name brand. You're trying to build a reputation separately. That's very expensive to do. It takes a big marketing budget. It takes a lot of work that's otherwise very expensive to do, but for the existence of these sort of integrated offerings that the platforms provide. Now, the Digital Markets Act just so happens to prohibit or complicate or make very difficult to provision of the marketplace services that provide a basis for these three basic things that the member companies want. There's one kind of direct way that I'll look at first, which is most of our member companies they'll make apps and they'll distribute apps through the app stores. They do not pay a commission to the app stores because they make real world goods and services. So instead, they pay a $99 registration fee every year to iOS or a $25 registration fee every year to Android. That's very cheap. And they get access otherwise for free to APIs, to the trust that people have in the ecosystem, to the vetting of the app. So there's the automated vetting of the app and the human vetting of the app. So they're spot checking for issues with the app or any sort of line of code that they might have sourced someplace else that might have a vulnerability that they didn't catch. These are services that are very valuable. And so, admittedly, our member companies really benefit from a progressive fee structure on the app stores that exist today. Now, Digital Markets Act in implementing Article, I think it's 5.4, looks at the fee structure and basically says that's illegal. You can't charge some apps 30%, which by the way, it's less than 1% of apps on the stores pay this higher fee that then cross subsidizes the rest of the ecosystem, my member companies for the most part. So they say that's illegal. We're not really sure what fee structure would be legal, but why don't you propose one? And so right now the major app stores are going through their own sort of very specific, very tailor-made guessing game with the European Commission, where they offer a compliance program. The European Commission looks at it and says, that's nice. That's nice. And the designated gatekeeper says, okay, so is that compliant? And the answer is, I don't know. We'll see. We may fine you, back to Mike's point, 10% of your global revenue. But we'll just have to sort of see how it plays out. Now, this dynamic has really hurt the ecosystem because nobody knows what exactly is legal. Nobody knows, what kind of fee structure is going to result. The only thing we do know is that it is going to directly cost our member companies more because the only way the app stores can go is more regressive. Because again, sort of the major complainants, the ones that really want Digital Markets Act to be imposed on the app stores and operating systems, happen to be companies that pay that 30%. It's Spotify, it's sort of Match Group, and it's companies that are, not getting the deal they want when it comes to distribution of their software. And so they're going to legislatures and saying, hey, you need to lower these costs for us. The only problem is they're trying to rewrite the rules for all the rest of the ecosystem too. And we don't want to see our direct costs go up. Again, the other provision I'll mention is 6.7, Article 6.7 of DMA, which is sort of, think of it as a must carry mandate, back to media rules. Where an app store has to carry all content by default. There are ways that they can overcome the presumption that they have to carry everything. The problem, you would think that app developers kind of could get behind that, right? Oh, I get carriage on this app store. The only problem is sort of defeats the purpose of wanting to go to the app store in the first place, because you create cybersecurity risks, you create new sort of quality problems on the store. You force my member companies to be listed right next to companies that may be stealing their content. And the app stores are sort of, they don't really want to put 10% of their revenue at risk to remove what might be a copycat app anymore. So again, these are the things that our member companies demand from the app stores. They want them to remove copycat apps. They want them to be proactive about policing for cybersecurity and malware risks. And now the DMA comes in and says, don't be proactive. Don't manage your store. And so the member companies, whether they're in the US or the EU or wherever else they might happen to be in the world, given that DMA is sort of de facto global at this point, they're all very negatively affected by that. And we're fighting it everywhere it pops up.
Thanks, Graham. And I think it bears emphasis from what you said that there are a lot of people who seem to have the mindset that these digital markets are zero sum, that there must be an inherent antagonism between the app stores and the developers, between big tech and little tech, etc. And that's just simply not true. And I'm going to move in a moment to some general questions for the panel. Um,
David, can I
and
quickly chime in on that point about the big versus the small, if that's all right?
yeah, Mike, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what Graham said. I mean, you look at small independent shops. I don't know, you want to try a new Italian place, and they go on Google and put their details on Google Maps or whatever it is, and usually that will get them the demand. So the key thing here, which regulators often forget about, is the network effect and how beneficial it is. And that's what we're all trying to get at, is actually the more people chime in into a particular platform online, the more it becomes beneficial for its members. And this is why we like viral things. This is because we see the average person say something funny or, sing a song and then just use that network effect to boost themselves into popularity. And the problem is when the regulator tries and break down these companies, they take this massive advantage which gives to all its users, which is the network effect. The more people that put in input data, the more use we get out of it. So this is one key aspect which I found many regulators tend to neglect, and it sadly does hurt smaller businesses more than bigger businesses because they rely more on the network effect.
I am especially worried about some of the newer features that might be coming out. Uh, One thing that James mentioned was the new feature for AirPods, and that's a great benefit for consumers. I think the more we can sort of show that DMA in particular is robbing consumers of these newer benefits, the better chance we have of sort of pulling this stuff back. But there are also new features for my member companies in particular. Amazon has a bunch of new features that they're rolling out for sellers in particular that enable them to very granularly analyze how well a specific product is doing versus past versions of it, and then pretty soon there will be features that will show you sort of forecast how a new product might do. And so again, these are sort of overhead things that the marketplaces are doing a really good job of like trying to think of new ways to use, but stuff like that is at great risk with a DMA and ex ante approach that draws a line in the sand at the offering of any sort of complementary service because it happens to be an example of self-preferencing, and it's an example of promoting the platform's own products. Never mind the fact that it's something that really works and that's something that small businesses in particular like to rely on because they don't have the resources to do it in-house for themselves. So that really, I just wanted to pinpoint that issue as one that really worries us.
I think that one of the fundamental mistakes that a lot of regulators make in many jurisdictions is they fail to realize that digital markets have developed in the way that they have for a reason, and that's because all of these complexities and nuances and standards serve a purpose for the developers, for the platform owners, for consumers, or whomever else, and it's sort of Chesterton's fence all the way down the seller features that Amazon offers democratizes the process of retail, and it allows small people or small businesses or individuals to compete with the biggest firms. The security measures on the App Store create a trustworthy and safe environment for consumers, which increase the reach of small developers, and the list goes on and on. Now, um, as I turn towards general questions for the panel, I would just like to remind the audience that we will have a question and answer period at the end of this webinar. So please put your questions into the chat, and they, by the magic of technology, will be funneled through to me, and I will pose them to the panel in the concluding few minutes. Now, I think if there is one thesis of this webinar. It's that principles have consequences, and that it's necessary to take, an empirical economic view of how X, Y, or Z regulation will affect consumers or businesses or whomever else. But also there's a larger climate of thought on both sides of the Atlantic that is unfriendly to innovation and experimentation and permissionless innovation, if I may borrow from somebody whom we all know well. So the DMA and other laws, I think, to probe the sort of one of the first of these principles, the DMA rests on a flawed assumption, and that is the assumption that it is possible to create a perfect digital ecosystem. This seems to lead regulators into a perpetual cycle of goalpost shifting and the creation of new standards for compliance after the previous standards fail to achieve the utopian ends that have been set out. And the whole process is somewhat arbitrary, and companies' good faith efforts to comply with each new regulation are met with new condemnations, new investigations, and new fines. So the question I will pose for the group, and beginning with James, is how does the arbitrary and mutable nature of regulatory guidance and enforcement actions affect the ability of real people to innovate?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, and I think you kind of laid out part of the answer there in asking the question insofar as that there's a massive, tax that's basically put on these companies to go and figure out navigating what this environment's supposed to look like, and that uncertainty is devastating for companies. Graham was talking earlier about how it's like, all right, even if you are a company that's like, even if you didn't like it, now you're trying to comply with it and you put forward what you think is supposed to be compliance. And then you're like, so did I hit the mark or not? And they're like, we'll get back to you on that when we have an enforcement action, maybe. Right? That's not a good relationship to have with your regulator in general. That's going to result in this outcome where you have a lot more money getting dedicated to legal departments instead of research and development departments. The United States right now is leading the world in AI investments to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars, in the short-term future. And every single time one of these, international regulatory regimes comes up, that's another few $1 million at a minimum that's getting siphoned away towards lawyers instead of engineers. And when we are in a race to become the global leader in these technologies, you want all your money going in towards developing and enhancing these products and having that experience with your users, by the way. Like, again, that rollout being delayed in the EU means that now all of a sudden there's a delay in the feedback loop now from a product development standpoint, because they're not getting as much data back from users like what American users might like. Yeah, sure. Obviously, there's 300 million plus people in the US markets. We can work with that, but European customers are certainly different than American customers, and what they might like is different. And now we're being denied that data because you've goalpost shifted here, and companies don't want to deal with the 10% of global revenue fines that they're going to be facing underneath something like the DMA. When you're talking about a multi-trillion dollar company like Apple, like Meta, like Amazon, that's not insignificant money that they're facing in a fine. This is why, I appreciated the Trump administration being so pointed in its criticism with the EU in going and pursuing these kinds of fines against American firms, because at the end of the day, it's just ridiculous. And I think that the other thing that Europe has to understand too with this is that it's actually hurting themselves in so many other critical ways, right? You're seeing a result in capital flight going out of the European Union towards the United States. If they were a little bit less crazy on the regulatory front, you'd see more investment and development of goods and services and products by European firms in the bloc. But because of their approach, that's not going to happen. And all the best minds, they're going to be coming to America. Why? Because there's a permission structure here for you to build, baby build, as our president would go and say, right? We want to go and see that happen. And that's I think the true cost of like having this uncertainty that's created by something like the DMA.
If I may chime in, I think you can also look like at who's asking for those regulations. It is not the innovators, it's the incumbent. When you look at things like the digital services tax, the people that asked for it in Canada, they were not the internet companies. They were rather the large legacy media corporations, things like TV broadcasters and production companies, because they wanted to get that revenue so that they could use it, and since they were subject to some Canadian content requirement, wanted to have the U.S. companies, the innovators, be subject to the same exact requirements. If you look at the Online News Act, the sort of like link tax I was alluding to, that affected news stories shared on Meta um, and on Google, the people that were asking for this were the folks in charge of news media. So really, it's not the innovators, it's the incumbents, is the ones that are seeing their markets being threatened, that try and ask for these regulations, and they do it because it seems to be cheaper and easier for them to ask for those regulations rather than to innovate. And I think that does go into this whole issue of innovation. If you're seeing that it's easier to regulate, why innovate, right?
Would anybody else on the panel like to chime in before I jump to the next question?
I was just going to go and add one other little point real fast, that I think that the other unintended consequence of this too is that, I think it's kind of comedic to me that, you're passing all these regulations because you're trying to target the big tech companies. Because of the compliance costs, they're going to, even if they don't like it, they are certainly best positioned to be able to deal with that. Smaller companies will not. And if the entire purpose of something like the DMA was to foster competition and get more dynamism in the marketplace, you're actually taking a pathway for those entrepreneurs off the table, because there's going to be a threshold afterwards where if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm going to say, do I really want to go and invest in dealing with all this compliance nightmare? Or do I just go and sell my firm off to one of these very same companies, actually going and taking off that increased dynamism, objective that the European Union is so desperate for, off the table? Because again, why am I going to go and deal with the regulatory morass and uncertainty, because there's no clear, outcome when we're dealing with European regulators?
Plus one on that, if I could, because if one of our member companies put it really, really well. This is a guy based in France who observed that, and Renaud brought this up as well, that BlackBerry used to be assailed as a monopoly, and an immovable monopoly, one that could never be challenged. And he used to develop on top of BlackBerry. And he said, look, if regulators came along and designed regulations specifically tailor-made for BlackBerry, I fear that I would still be developing for BlackBerry right now. Great, it was a great system. Love the QWERTY keyboard, but I would rather have companies come in and compete with BlackBerry, with Apple, with Google, with Amazon on the merits, and create their own version of what and these companies provide, rather than requiring these companies to create a platform on which these other companies are, providing something on top of it.
So Graham,
sorry, if I
Renaud,
can
please.
just add a quick thing on this. Like BlackBerry is not the company it used to be anymore. But if you look at the tech sector in the Waterloo area where it was developed, it is thriving. You have a lot of companies that are there. You've got a lot of startups. The fact that we never that Canada in a weird moment of good policy ideas did not decide to try and protect BlackBerry at all costs. Well, the result has not been a loss for the Canadian economy. It's been a loss for BlackBerry. Let's be clear. But the Canadian economy as a whole, there's a lot of startups that start in that area. There's still a very vibrant tech sector there, because ultimately the minds that had those new ideas are still there, and they're still trying to create new products.
Yeah, I mean, anyone here remembers MySpace? The point is there is competition, right? This is the problem. These regulators think that in their idealistic world that there is no competition, but in reality is there is. And there's a very fierce competition, even between the big players, to try and nab consumers and users here and there. So it's always been there, and arguably it's what driven us to innovate, and we are where we are. I mean, you look at, for example, Google now, where it has the AI summary at the top of your search result. Well, that wouldn't have happened if there wasn't ChatGPT there, or other AI models trying to compete with Google and trying to give you a more succinct, quicker answer. So, and when I was engaging with regulators, they were always asking us, when it comes to competitive policies, they were always asking consumers in the surveys whether they were switching or not. But the question shouldn't be whether consumers switch or not, is whether they are happy switching or not, or whether they are happy with their current ecosystems. And I think this is the key thing. Regulators do not see consumer convenience as a key element. And I'm sorry to say, but I like using Apple because I found it very convenient for me. And these companies have known how to create these ecosystems that work for me as a consumer. I like, copying a website from my iPhone and being able to paste it on my Mac. It's simple things like that which actually are convenient for a consumer.
Well, or I should say, in the spirit of dynamism and innovation and flexibility in the face of new circumstances, I'm going to jump a little bit out of order to a question that has come in from the chat, which I think bears on some of the issues we've been discussing. And that question is, what would you say to the argument that these EU regulations are trying to level the playing field by removing barriers that prevent competitors from competing in a market? And to sort of maybe put it a little bit more pointedly, many of the regulations discussed in the EU and in other jurisdictions purport to hold down the power of the big tech companies explicitly for the purpose of propping up little tech. So, Graham, beginning with you, have these regulations accomplished their stated end? Have they backfired? Can you expand on that?
No. Yeah, it definitely backfired. The problem is that it actually makes it harder for our member companies to succeed, grow, scale, because it forces them to source all of the elements that have to be cobbled together to distribute internationally, and then to build the consumer trust necessary to create a condition where a consumer, an end consumer, is willing to download an app made by a company that they have never heard of. And so if you think about it in those terms, we all take that for granted right now. And it's because of all the measures that these operating systems and app stores take to ensure that the app is going to do what it says it's going to do, that it's not going to steal your data, that all of these proactive measures of vetting and, hey, what kinds of data are you asking for? Does it comport with the purpose of the app? All of those things are under a Digital Markets Act regime called into question and presumptively sort of illegalized in order to try and serve this purpose of making it easier for another competitor to come in. So it has the opposite effect by making it really hard to source all of those necessary inputs that, again, a lot of people take for granted, but are really important to scale up and succeed in the app economy.
I think just to pick up off what Graham said, man, there was such a great trigger word in there for me in the level playing field. Nothing goes and irritates me more when I hear that, because when everybody talks about whether it's a company or a politician or whatever, whomever, I should say, advocates for a level playing field, somehow, for some reason, the solution that gets proposed ends up going and ratcheting up the regulatory effect that's there. I wish for a level playing field too, but why does the level playing field have to mean that we are adding regulatory scrutiny onto the books? And as good as the United States is, we still have our host of issues here. We have over 70,000 pages of regulations in the Federal Register. There are plenty of things that are going in, I think, keeping the American economy from roaring even harder than it otherwise could be right now, but for those regulations. So I think that, I think when you're trying to think through the solutions in this space, it might be about identifying other barriers that might be there that are actually just making it more difficult for a startup to get off and get off the ground running, right? So I think like another classic example I think of is just how difficult it's become for people to get onto the New York Stock Exchange, more broadly speaking. If you're, again, just different routes for entrepreneurs to go and make their company be viable in this 21st century economy, certainly being part of that ecosystem on the NYSE, or having access to venture capital, or even crowdsourcing funding, right? Like the regulations and rules that surround that are really difficult. So I would urge caution against the notion of leveling the playing field by putting forward these regulatory proposals, because it might actually end up backfiring in basically cutting off opportunities for these entrepreneurs. I'll say actually this is one area where the UK, I think, kind of recognized something was amiss here. when we were looking at financial technologies, and they realized like, oh wait, these aren't quite like banks. We shouldn't be putting banking regs on them. So they started Project Innovate back in 2014, which set up one of the first regulatory sandboxes, which despite what Turner Losel will say, are very sexy, Turner. But basically, that's a dynamic environment that allows for companies, I think, to have a lighter touch approach to understanding what are the right kinds of regulations that might need to be in place. Because I think the problem is like when we're looking at these spaces, that we're basically looking at a static market environment. When, as you kind of pointed out, David, and others, is that it's constantly evolving. What we think the market is actually just what it is in that particular moment. But there's a lot of undercurrents that are going on there that are actually changing what the future might look like. So I think that that requires a little bit of humility, which is why I liked what the UK did with their Project Innovate and regulatory sandbox programs that we're seeing here in the United States. Companies, sorry, not companies, states, and now even the federal government increasingly looking at as like a potential solution towards finding out what that level playing field should look like here in the 21st century.
Part of the problem with the whole level playing field idea as well is this. If we go back to the people that actually do competition policy, these are not economists, these are lawyers. They've got a vision of competition that seems to be anchored in very simple mathematics. So, looking at the CRTC in Canada, our local telecommunication regulator, they've been trying for nearly 20 years to improve competition in the telecom market. By which I mean they've been trying to attract one more major telecom provider to the country. The whole logic is if we have just one more company enter the field, then the field is more competitive. Every single time we lose a company, then the field is less competitive. Competition is not just a matter of number of firms that are active, it's rather a matter of barriers to entry. And a lot of those barriers to entry come directly from government. So it's moving out of the tech sector a little bit, but the best recent example I've seen actually comes from Canada. The Competition Bureau looked at grocery stores because, of course, we all went through this period of high inflation. There was this idea that the reason why the cost of grocery was high was that grocery stores suddenly became greedy and were able to increase prices. So they did a whole 52-page report. The conclusion of the report was that, yeah, we need one more large grocery store chain in Canada. We need to attract a foreign grocer. But if you look in the report, so it's a 52-page report. On page 36, they actually asked foreign grocers if they had looked at coming into Canada, and if they did, what was preventing them from coming to Canada. And a lot of them said that they have looked into it because it's a very profitable market. But when they looked at it, the labeling laws, because we're a bilingual country, were very, very expensive to meet. If you've got 30,000 or 40,000 products in your store, and all of them need to have French and English language on it, well, it's expensive to make that change for a small market. They also looked into it and said, well, the margins are not that high. Canadian grocery chains make about 3% net profit at the end of the year. And then they looked at it and said, well, the other thing is we're scared of the large Canadian grocers because they are very competitive. So for the competition policy, folks, that was not good enough. It's just we need one more large grocer. Everything's going to be cheaper. But when you actually look at at a lot of what could be done to stimulate competition, I think the first part is given the current the current regulatory framework, it is as competitive as it can be. But then if you were to free up some of those regulations, simplify some of the labeling laws, you could have an additional entrant in the market. You could have cheaper prices. And the same can be said for the tech sector. This idea of bringing one more large telecom company, this idea of bringing one more newspaper chain, one more platform to the market. It's not a matter of bringing that extra platform. It's a matter of having a regulatory environment that is permissive for it to emerge if there's a need from the consumer perspective.
Well, I think we probably have time for a final question from the audience, which seems to be full of devil's advocates. And that question is, how do you respond to critics who argue that relying solely on existing antitrust frameworks is too slow and reactive to fast-moving tech markets? And I think that illustrates a larger change in thinking on competition policy, whereas in the old view, the value that companies provide is measured by consumers as expressed through their spending or their clicks or their screen time or whatever else. In the new view, though, the preferences of consumers have been disregarded in favor of myopic notions of fair competition held by the regulators. I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on this change and on the effects of the effects of this revolution in competition policy that say that the old model is old and outdated and too slow for modern conditions.
I'll just say that thus far it hasn't shown itself to work better for people because it's robbing people of newer features. It's going to so far it has caused a lot of uncertainty for small businesses. We know that it's going to increase uh, entry barriers for software in particular because their costs are going to go up both directly in the form of app store distribution fees that will be imposed on smaller companies now that the progressive fee structure has been illegalized because it's quote unquote unfair for the companies that pay more. And then also in terms of consumer trust and all of the inputs that have to go into building that. Now our member companies have to be listed next to apps that may have stolen their content or that may have just a nefarious purpose. And so an ex ante approach may be faster in the sense that it creates an outcome really fast, but the outcome is bad so far.
Don't confuse activity for results, as they say.
Yeah, I think for me the key shift as well is, I don't know if you want to call it the nationalization of private spaces. I mean, at the end of the day, some of these platforms are private spaces, and the government seems to be keen on getting in there. I mean, this is especially poignant for online safety and all that. But at the end of the day, when you tell someone we're going to regulate Google or X or whatever it is, well, it's not compulsory for people to, go on these platforms. They've got other choices they can use. So the regulators have a fundamental misunderstanding on that, as well as trying to interfere in what is a private market. And at the end of the day, we have to appreciate that it is private. It is not governed property. It's not essential for everyone to put a tweet out. It's not essential for everybody to use Google. I mean, you can use Mozilla Firefox if you still want to. Nothing's stopping you. You can use Yahoo instead of Google. So it's just the shift in mentality and taking it for granted that everyone has to use Google or everyone uses Google. That in itself is a problematic view. And in terms of, it goes back to the level playing
Well,
field argument.
also, Mike, if I could
Yeah,
quickly break in before you
yeah.
continue, it's also the assumption that everybody will use Google.
Mm. Well, indeed, and that's the other thing. And on the level playing field remark, and that ties into it. Well, okay, if you want to create a level playing field entering, you've got to provide a level playing field in delivering. And are you able to deliver to billions around, the world globally? Uh, I'm not so sure. If there are companies that can do it because they've invested significant amount of money. I mean, Microsoft today in the trade prosperity agreement between the UK and US promised $40 billion, I think, in the UK. I'd like to see someone who can match that. So that's my take of it. I appreciate that we need to encourage competition, but competition is best driven by markets and innovation. It is not a regulator's plaything.
I would just like put out as a final quick thought on that too, that part of the reason why it might be slow as well is that these regulators are not equipped with the staff to go and understand what exactly is in front of them. Renaud was talking about how there's a bunch of lawyers, not economists, and that's why there might be some misconceptions about what the actual marketplace might look like. But also to a degree too, like, they certainly do have technologists and everything, so it's not to say that they don't, but they're not necessarily going to have like sufficient expertism to necessarily understand how this technology works. So now if we go and try to shift our model away and encourage more aggressive antitrust action, you might get more cases like Lena Khan trying to block Activision and Microsoft because, oh, well, God forbid we get some digital skins that are unique to Xbox and not available on Sony PlayStation. Oh, the harm. It's so horrible if I can't get that skin. And lo and behold, the video game community went and roasted her for it, deservedly so, because it's like you don't know what the hell you're talking about as a regulator, and that's actually really disconcerting. So I think like if you're looking to go and see a more robust response from antitrust enforcers when there may be anti-competitive conduct occurring in the marketplace, then let's go and invest in our regulators to have the proper staffing to understand what exactly they're looking at. Because the reality is right now they don't. And look no farther than the conversation on AI, and you're looking at European regulators with the EU AI Act, they don't even know what that's supposed to look like. They don't have a proper answer for it. And they actually do invest in having a lot of people on staff to understand it. So if they can't even figure that out, I don't know how we're expecting American regulators to do that any better. But I do think that, again, that's the more fundamental thing that I would be focused on is that, okay, invest in your regulators to go and enforce the existing laws that are on the books more robustly. That is a lot more responsible than erecting an entire new regulatory regime that will surely get abused by regardless of who's in charge of the FTC.
I gotta disagree on this one. I'm not sure investing more in the regulator and giving them more means to regulate additionally would be the best thing. I really think when we talk about these antitrust cases, part of the reason why they're so long, I I don't think it's a fault that they're so long. If we look at the way that regulators operate and that these antitrust cases are being brought, often, as Mike alluded to, I mean, regulators look backwards, right? They're looking at what used to be the big thing and then decide that maybe that's too big of a thing. If regulators were looking at BlackBerry back in the early 2000s, they would probably have broken it up. And yet, Apple was able to do that just in a couple of years by taking its market share. We might be in a moment where looking at AI, it's been clear for a very long time that Google was the go-to search engine. Now, there's maybe this impression that it might not be the go-to search engine anymore. It might just be ChatGPT or any other AI app that occurs. The regulator just looks at the state of the market as it is now. It forgets that it is not omniscient. And it does not know what's going to be the next big thing. It does not know what's going to come up to replace that big thing from before. I mean, I'm talking about BlackBerry. I'm talking about about Google. But even if we go back, I'm sure there was a cutting edge typewriter manufacturer that at some point had cornered a significant enough share of the market. It doesn't mean that they're still making typewriters anymore, or that it's a problem, even if they have 100% of the market.
James, would you like to take a last word before we conclude?
No, I think that when it's all said and done, we know the cautionary tale that the European Union has I think put out in this space, and it'd be strongly advisable for U.S. lawmakers not to go down that path. We're in a global race for technology leadership, not just in AI, but in quantum, in 6G, and a whole bunch of other industries, right? And if we want to go and win those races, it requires having that light touch, dynamic, regulatory environment that understands that humility that's necessary, that they don't know what they don't know, and to really, I think, again, avoid that outcome. There's only going to be a couple of people that can practically lead in this space, so let's not go and do anything to shoot ourselves in the foot.
I think that is a wonderful place to leave this discussion. I would like to commend to our audience the Taxpayers Protection Alliance's website, protectingtaxpayers.org, where you can find more information about all of these topics. And I would also note that this panel has been recorded and will be up on our YouTube page. And I would also like to plug our socials on Instagram and Twitter. So thank you, Graham. Thank you, James. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Renaud. And ladies and gentlemen of the audience, thank you.